Hey Optimancers, Chris here. 2 years ago I released a video called How to Calculate Damage Per Round. And the point of that video was simple enough. Damage in D&D is done through math, and although there are random aspects to calculating damage, we, through use of averages, can still calculate a number which we call damage per round, or DPR. By doing this, we can compare one build to another and, in theory, determine which is better at doing damage. Since then, I've completed DPR calculations for any build I do that has dealing damage as either the primary component or one of the components of the build. So that way the viewer can determine how effective the build is at dealing damage. Though the dirty truth is not really. Today I'm going to show how DPR really doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and it's far more subjective than objective when used as a tool to determine damage output. I'll also discuss whether DPR is useful at all, and how we should look at DPR when evaluating potential character builds. If you want to come discuss the value of DPR with me and some like-minded players, or anything else D&D related, come visit my Discord community. Anyone is welcome to join, there's no cost, and the link is in the video description. If you like the content of this channel and would like to support this content, please come check out my Patreon community. Patrons of this channel receive rewards like exclusive chat channels on my Discord, early ad-free releases of these videos, and my top-level patrons can play one-shots of D&D every month, DM'd by me. All with other players from a great and welcoming community. We have players of all experience levels and all optimization levels, and we have a great time. Today, some of those amazing people I would like to thank are Nick Lutz, Nick Simmons, Pedro DeVaca, Philip Martin, Philip Glorvigen, Robbies, Rohit, Ryan Squire, Safes, and Scott Ballantyne. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Also, a shout out to my friend Eric from Fry Minis. Check out his channel for spell videos, mini reviews, and other D&D content. Link in the video description below. Let's get started. So, you need a quick character for a level 10 game and decide you want a character that does good damage. So, you check online for some build ideas and you come across two builds you think look pretty good. Build A apparently does about 25 damage per round and Build B does 35 damage per round. You decide that since Build B does more damage, it's the build you should go for. But does Build B actually do more damage? Not so fast. Let's look a little closer at what those numbers actually mean. Calculating damage per round is a messy process that has a lot more wild guesswork or straight out ignoring things that will absolutely impact damage but are hard to calculate than most people realize. And even if all that was not the case, it's still not a great tool for predicting damage. Let's go through why. First, let's discuss some variables. So, we're calculating average damage for a Hexblade. Is Hex up? What if you lose concentration? Are we accounting for the bonus action to cast Hex in the first place? What about Hexblade's Curse? Are we adding that damage? What about the bonus action to set that up? Isn't that 2 full turns of setup? What percentage of attacks are we assuming the Curse for? Are we using Eldritch Smite? What about knocking prone with Eldritch Smite? Do we count for the enemy being knocked prone? How many attacks will get advantage? Do we have a familiar? Is it providing the help action to us in combat? What if it dies? Are we accounting for that? What about spell slots? Warlocks don't have many spell slots. How are we accounting for them? And looking at 10 different builds for Hexblade, you could find that DPR calculated 10 different ways with 10 different results for the exact same build. And this just scratches the surface. Let's say we have a mounted character, and we take the mounted combatant feat. Are we going to have advantage on attacks? Well, it depends how large the enemies are. How do we know that? How do we know how often we'll be mounted? What about when our mount dies? Or we're dismounted? If we're using a lance, how often will we be at the required 10 feet? What if we get stuck at 5 feet? Have we accounted for that? If so, how? Let's say we have Polar Master or Sentinel. We should be getting more opportunity attacks, right? But how many? Will we get one every other round? Every 4 rounds? Or at all? Does it change if we have a reach weapon? How much? What if we use our reaction for something else? If we have, say, the shield spell, or absorb elements, or some other reaction, shouldn't we reduce the number of opportunity attacks? But if so, by how much? Now, let's say we have Shadow Blade, or Pack Tactics, or some other circumstantial method of getting advantage. How often can we expect it to happen? Can we as players even predict any of this? And the answer to that is no. So what do? I'll tell you what we do. We guess. Or, failing that, we pull a number out of thin air. Because I can't even guess how often you'll be fighting in sunlight at your table. How could I? So I'm going to ignore it, guess, or make something up. Even though it may have a huge impact on the results, because there's no other way to do it. Now you could say, and I have said, that if you remain consistent, then at least you reduce the variables. For example, I assume you will trigger Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade secondary damage half the time. And I make that same assumption regardless of the build, so that way it's consistent from build to build. Except, is that really being consistent? What if my Booming Blade character can disengage for free? Shouldn't they have it triggered more often? Shouldn't a character with both Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade have a higher chance of the trigger happening, since they can choose to use the one that's more likely to trigger in any specific situation? Shouldn't an opportunity attack made with Warcaster and Booming Blade have a higher chance of triggering secondary damage than someone just going toe-to-toe with somebody? Of course it should. So is that so-called consistency really giving us more accurate numbers? Maybe sometimes, but other times, maybe not. Also, what if I'm comparing a Booming Blade to a non-Booming Blade build? Doesn't the percentage, whatever subjective number I came up with, and apply consistently to Booming Blade builds, make that comparison suspect? I mean, if we think about it, do Booming Blade spells trigger secondary damage half the time at your table? If not, then the comparison falls apart. And that's just a few of the multitude of variables. When I do builds, I face these kinds of variables all the time. Will we be in dim light? How often? Will there be sunlight? How often? What size will the enemies be? How often? How many enemies will be in the average fight? How bunched up will they be? Will I face any relevant immunities or resistances? How often? How many fights per day? How many rounds per fight? Did I have a chance to precast spells? How many short rests will there be? And even if we establish standards for these things, DPR still breaks down when you think about it. For example, I use an 8 combat day with 4 rounds per combat and 1 short rest when I determine DPR. I'm told this is far too long a combat day. Still, do you really know what your next adventuring day will bring? Is every adventuring day the same, with the same encounters, in the same environments, with the same amount of time to prepare? Because if they aren't, then it really doesn't matter how well or poorly I guessed, because DPR is falling apart either way. And I can have 2 builds, and the first shows a higher DPR, and then I reduce the number of encounters, and now the other build shows a higher DPR. Then I throw in an additional short rest, and maybe it reverses again, or maybe it becomes even more lopsided. Add sunlight, bunched up enemies, or any other of the near infinite possible variables, and once they are accounted for, the DPRs of the 2 builds change by different amounts, and sometimes in different directions. Assuming we don't know exactly what our next adventuring day will bring, just what do these numbers tell us? And in reality, the answer is not nearly as much as a lot of people seem to think. It goes further though, a lot further. Let's say we have 2 builds and we're calculating DPR for each of them. Maybe one's a fighter and the other one's an artificer. So at second level, we dutifully note that the artificer uses an arcane infusion to get a +1 weapon. So we faithfully adjust our DPR numbers. They have a 5% greater chance to hit and a +1 damage with each hit. Then when they achieve 10th level and the infusion becomes +2, we dutifully increase the chance to hit by 10% and +2 damage to each hit. But does this really make sense? Are we really assuming the 10th level fighter is still using a non-magic weapon? And yes, we are. Because we've decided as a community that you can't, or at least shouldn't, add magical equipment we can't count on receiving. The Artificer is guaranteed that +2 weapon, so we can add it, and the fighter can't, so we don't. This, however, it's not realistic. Magic weapons exist in most campaigns. Now, your chance to find a magic weapon isn't 100%, but it's sure not 0% either. When we give that Artificer a +2 weapon and the fighter no magic weapon, the comparison becomes likely inaccurate, maybe even disingenuous. And let's talk about magic weapons. If you've played D&D, you've likely come across them. You've likely used them. Likely discuss which party members get them. So picture the last 10 magic weapons you've found. Or open any adventure path and look what magic weapons are offered. You know what you'll find? I think I have a pretty good guess. Most commonly, the dagger, likely. Then long swords, short swords, spears, great swords, hand axes, battle axes, light crossbows, javelins, maybe a magic mace, maybe a magic scimitar. You know what you probably won't find? A magic hand crossbow, a magic glaive, a magic halberd, or a magic maul. Yet these show up exponentially more on optimized builds. And this makes sense, because if we assume there is no chance of a magic weapon, then why worry about what weapon we will likely find? Making reasonable choices about what weapon you use based on what magic weapon you're likely to find in a campaign doesn't boost your DPR numbers at all. So why do it? So when we're looking at feats like Polearm Master, Crossbow Expert, Crusher, Slasher, Piercer, when we make a character counting on finesse weapons, or lances, or any other specific kind of weapon, do we account for the reduced likelihood of coming across a magic weapon? I'll tell you that nobody out there doing DPR calculations that I'm aware of does that. And it gets even worse when we start talking about spells. How much damage can you expect from a Shadow Blade? Well, if it's replacing a non-magic weapon, we have some idea. We still are guessing about lighting conditions, and there's that bonus action to cast it we often ignore, but at least we know the base weapon damage compared to the weapon we would otherwise use. But do we really? What is the weapon it's replacing? Well, again, we're assuming it's not magical. If we find a flame blade, is the Shadow Blade still doing more damage? What if the weapon's a +2? Wouldn't it hit more often than a Shadow Blade? So when we compare the Shadow Blade spell to other spells that essentially deal damage, are we taking into account that we might be using a magic weapon and therefore the comparison might be different? Of course not. And what about animate objects? This spell can do 10 times 1d4 plus 4 damage every round as a bonus action for the caster. It also isn't available until 9th level at the earliest, and the damage is non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage. How often are our enemies resistant to this damage by this level? Pretty often. I know that when I've discussed animate objects and done damage calculations for them, I presented both the non-resistant and the resistant DPRs. And I think that's become pretty much the standard for this spell alone for some reason. Because I find that same scrutiny doesn't hold up when people are looking at other spells. I've recently been in conversations with people suggesting how much damage they could expect from conjure animals. But unless you're a shepherd druid, you shouldn't expect that damage to be magical either. Nor from your summon greater demon spell, nor from your conjure elemental spell. How do we account for all that non-magical commonly resisted damage? And here's something more horrifying to consider. How do we account for when the enemies are immune to that damage? What about thrown weapon builds? What is the DPR of that level 10 thrown weapon build? What percentage of those thrown weapons are magical? If it's not 100%, has the DPR been adjusted to account for the likely resistance we'll face? Probably not. But let's say we had some kind of future divining powers, and every table was the same, and everything was known. We know exactly how many battles we have. We know exactly how many rounds they'll take. We know what size the enemies will be, what conditions they may have, and when. We know what the lighting conditions will be. We know which spells we will have up and which we won't. We know what resistances and immunities we'll face. We know what our magic items are. We know what position we'll be in. We know what buffs we'll have, what support from other party members we'll likely have. We know everything. So then, when we calculate the DPR of two builds, then for sure we'll know which one does more damage. Actually, no, we still won't. Because now we have to talk about damage consistency. So let's say we have two builds. In this perfect world I've described where we know everything, one of them is going to hit once a round for 50 points of damage. The other hits 5 times a round for 10 points of damage with each hit. They have the same DPR, but the actual damage they're going to inflict is going to be very different. For example, let's say there's an enemy with 10 hit points left. The first build will do 10 points of damage on their turn. The second build will do 10 points of damage and then 40 points of damage to somebody else. The second build just did 5 times more damage with the same DPR. Builds that employ big hits and do tons of damage are fun to play, but their DPR is even more inaccurate because spillover damage is not damage at all. You can't inflict 100 points of damage to a creature with 5 hit points left. So even if we take into account and somehow predict all the near infinite variables, how the damage is inflicted also changes how two builds with the same DPR might actually perform. And DPR alone tells us nothing about that. Still, it gets even worse. I know, you must wonder how it could even possibly be worse, but it is. We've discussed the countless variables where the decision makers, like me, pull numbers out of our asses to account for the problem with ignoring magic items, how damage distributed between hits skews the numbers, how ignoring resistances gives us wacky and wildly inaccurate damage estimations. Surely DPR couldn't be even less reliable, but unfortunately, it is. How about movement? Does improved movement increase your DPR? Well, it should. I mean, being where you need to be in order to inflict damage makes a huge difference. How much does it impact actual DPR calculations? Not at all, of course. How about reach? Shouldn't improved reach mean we'll be making more attacks? You bet. How often have you missed out on attacking at all because your attacks couldn't reach the enemy? How much does it impact DPR calculations? You've got it. It doesn't. How about dark vision? Restriction in enemy selection, like what happens with sneak attack, green flame blade, or pack tactics? What about improved maneuverability from halfling nimbleness, or an orc's aggressive trait, or an Aarakocra's fly speed? Will those affect actual damage? Yes. Do we account for any of it at all? Nope. That brings us to the biggest one. Who does more damage? Build A that got charmed, or Build B that didn't? Who does more damage? Build A that fell to 0 hit points, or Build B that is still up? Who does more damage? Build A that's frightened, or Build B that isn't? Who does more damage? Build A that's caught in a web, or Build B that made their saving throw? Defenses improve DPR. It's as simple as knowing that doing some damage is more than doing 0 damage. DPR calculations assume, and I mean they kind of have to, that you're up, unhindered, not charmed, not frightened, not held, not poisoned, not restrained, not paralyzed, and the build needs to do nothing, and I mean nothing at all, to get these favorable assumptions. And this isn't a minor oversight. I mean, we're talking about a build doing 0 damage in a lot of these cases, and not one bit of attention was paid to that glaring problem. because we can just ignore it on the whiteboard of optimization and keep our DPR unaffected, even though in actual play, it will be a very different story. But believe it or not, we're not even done with the problems of DPR. Let's say we have two builds with identical DPR. All the variables, we'll ignore them. I mean, we do anyway. All the other things I've gone over, the extensive list as it is, we'll ignore all of it. Let's just pretend on our little whiteboard that none of those things matter. They do, of course, but let's pretend. So in this pretend world, we have two builds with identical DPR. Will these builds be equally effective at doing damage? Believe it or not, even in this fictional reality, even then, one may be more effective at doing damage than the other. Here's where we talk about controlling your damage. So build A does 10 damage with every hit, averaging 2 hits around, so they have a DPR of 20. Then we have build B that does 5 damage with every hit, averaging 2 hits around, so they have a DPR of 10. Except build B can do 15 damage per hit a certain amount of times per day, so we've calculated that to be half the time. So half the time we have 10 DPR, and half the time we have 30 DPR. So our total DPR is 20. So the builds have identical DPRs of 20. But isn't build B just tactically superior at delivering damage? We can get the better damage when we need it, and when we don't, then we don't. I mean, maybe we even do something else. But in those important combats against an enemy that's really dangerous, we can turn it on and do 50% more damage than build A. Being able to take advantage of that damage flexibility is going to be elementary, and it's going to have a massive impact on our overall effectiveness. And how much do we take that into account when calculating DPR? You guessed it, nada. Now, as I mentioned, I've been calculating DPR in builds, and these things are starting to bother me more and more. Now, to a certain extent, I've always known the limitations of DPR, so when I look at DPR calculations, I naturally view them with a very large grain of salt. And in honesty, I tend to use DPR very little when evaluating builds for myself. I don't ignore it entirely, but I recognize it's a pretty lousy evaluation tool. So why do DPR calculations at all? Well, because although DPR is a terrible tool, it's really the only mathematical tool we have to compare the damage of builds. So I think some DPR calculations can still be somewhat useful. However, what I see is DPR being used as a primary tool to evaluate builds, and that's a huge mistake. A higher DPR does not mean that the build will actually inflict more damage. In fact, it might do less damage. It might even do much less damage. I don't think, as I said, that it's useless to look at DPR, but you need to know what that number entails. Are spell slots being used? What about concentration? Is that concentration going to hold? What other variables are being considered? Are we ignoring a round or two that takes to set this combination up? Are we looking at a best case scenario? A worst case scenario? Are we somewhere in the middle? How many parts of this damage rely on resistances not being a factor? Or other factors? Do we have a free selection of enemies? And even once we look at all those things, we need to understand that DPR is really still largely a guess. There's some education to it, but it's largely a guess. And we can't say that a build that has more DPR than another build is actually going to inflict more damage. When we look at a build, what we should really be looking at is, how does the build function? How good are its defenses? Does it have decent combat maneuverability? Does it have vulnerabilities? Because all these things will affect even offensive capability. I have concerns that I've placed too much emphasis on this highly subjective and inaccurate tool in the past, and although I will continue to calculate DPR in the future, I suspect I'll reference it less in build evaluations as I continue to present builds. I hope this video explains why that's the case, and when you evaluate builds, even if you are evaluating builds at their capability for doing this one thing, damage, a DPR calculation is not an objective marker. It's a guess. And although there's some evidence to support that guess, there are way too many unaccounted for variables for us to pretend it is anything else. So here's the part where I ask, Are you convinced? How effective a tool do you find DPR to be when evaluating builds? Will you look at them differently in the future? Let's have a discussion in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.